Thanks, Bruce, and good morning, everyone. I'm your host, Bill Tavares, and I'm sitting in for Trudy Cox. Today, we go inside the Newport Mansions with our guest, Dr. Jonathan Michael Square. Dr. Square is the assistant professor of Black visual culture at Parsons School of Design. He earned a PhD from New York University, an MA from the University of Texas, and a BA from Cornell. Previously, he taught in the Committee on Degrees in History and Literature at Harvard and was a fellow in the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He curated the exhibition Past is Present, Black Artists Respond to Complicated Histories of Slavery at the Herron School of Art and Design, and he's currently preparing for his upcoming show titled African American Picture Gallery at the Winterthur Museum, Garden and Library. Dr. Square also leads the Digital Humanities Project, Fashioning the Self in Slavery and Freedom, and he is working on a book from which he will discuss a chapter on W.E.B. Du Bois today. On April 11th at Rosecliff, Dr. Square will present The Measure of a Man, Double Consciousness, and the Fashioning of W.E.B. Du Bois. Additional information about how to register to attend this lecture, part of an upcoming series, will be available soon on the newportmansions.org. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to be with you. So let's start with your lecture. It has an intriguing title: Measure of a Man, Double Consciousness, and the Fashioning of W.E.B. Du Bois. Can we break that down? Explain the concept of double consciousness for us.
The idea of double consciousness was introduced in his seminal work from 1901, The Souls of Black Folk. The concept describes how African Americans were sometimes made to view themselves through two lenses: their own subjective self-perception and the perception of larger white-dominated American society. So African Americans are not only forced to see themselves as individuals, but also burdened with being representatives of their race as they navigate the complex intersection of their experiences and the stereotypes and expectations of dominant American society. So Du Bois focused primarily on racial and national identities. And since then, we've broadened the way we think about identity. And I'm thinking in particular of the work of Kimberly Crenshaw and her idea of intersectionality, which kind of explodes the duality of Du Bois's idea and includes other things like race, class, gender, sexuality, which adds some complexity and nuance to the conversation and challenges and questions Du Bois's original idea. So we can think of there being like a triple consciousness or a quadruple consciousness.
It's interesting. It's not something that's probably well known today, the idea of double consciousness, but it seems like a pretty far thinking or forward thinking or insightful way to observe the identity of African Americans back at that time. I mean, do you think you think a lot of people outside of the field know what double consciousness refers to?
Yeah, I think if you've studied the work of Du Bois or someone who's steeped in African American history, you've probably have studied and have heard of this term before. But yeah, you're right. Like larger American society is probably unfamiliar with this idea. What I also like about the idea of double consciousness is that Du Bois often describes it as being a veil, sort of like a translucent textile that one can see through. And I really like that fashion. Being a fashion scholar, I really like that fashion reference that he uses.
Yeah, it's an interesting, the whole concept is really interesting. The second part of the title of your lecture, um, describe what you mean by the fashioning of W.E.B. Du Bois.
Yeah, people don't often associate Du Bois with fashion necessarily. It's an intervention that I'm making as a scholar. So what I mean by it is literally fashion, like the clothing that he wore. Um, I'm interested in how Du Bois was styled, but also how he styled himself. And so I'm thinking about um, and critically analyzing photos of him throughout his entire life. And Du Bois dressed rather conservatively. He typically wore sort of dark, basic suiting, but there's little tweaks over the course of his life that he makes. And I think that's really interesting to study. And of course, when I talk about fashion, I'm not only talking about clothing, even though that's key to what I study, but also fashioning transcends that. It goes to, you know, how he chose to call himself. So when he was a child, he went by Willie. That was his nickname. But of
Yeah,
course, we know him as W.E.B. Du Bois, William Edward Bogart Du Bois. And so he sort of had this long, sort of aristocratic sounding name. So he was really concerned about legacy building and sort of, he wouldn't use this term, and no one would have used this term at the time, but sort of his own personal brand.
sure.
He did a lot of genealogical work, and even though he wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth, he sort of made an effort to craft a narrative of nobility out of poverty.
He did a lot of lineage research himself.
He did, absolutely. Yeah, in fact, he applied to be a member of the Sons of the American Revolution because his family, he had roots back to prior to the American Revolution. So yeah, he did a lot of genealogical work.
Right, that's another part of it that I think I just in prepping for this interview, I didn't realize that his family history was actually not is very extensive and traceable.
Absolutely. Yeah, he had a pedigree. He was related to a lot of prominent Black New Englanders. And so yeah, he did a lot of genealogical work himself to track that history.
You've developed sort of an interesting approach to studying significant historical figures through the lens of fashion. What's the value of considering somebody, the self-fashioning of Du Bois?
Yeah, I think it's really important. And for whatever reason, well, I know the reason, it's an overlooked facet of, Du Bois's his work. People focus, rightly so, on his writing and on his activism. That's very important. But I also think there's a lot of information embedded in how he dressed and how he presented himself in the world. And the reason I say that we know why that it's overlooked is because within academic circles, there's hierarchies. And so, politics or the economy or intellectual history, sort of high-minded affairs get priority.
Sure.
And things like food or sports, popular culture, fashion are put on a lower rung. And so I think when people think about Du Bois, because he was so prolific, he wrote so much,
Yeah.
so multifaceted, they gravitate towards his like ideas and writing and sort of neglect how he was styling himself and his fashion.
I'm really intrigued by this idea of fashion as a window into some somebody maybe in a way that hasn't been um, utilized or examined. How did you arrive at this as sort of an idea that you wanted to continue to pursue? Because obviously, Du Bois isn't the only person that you've done this with. But how did you arrive at this idea?
So my broader scholarly interest is on enslaved people's dress. So how um, enslaved and free African Americans were dressing in the 18th and 19th centuries. And I'm actually in the process of writing a book on that topic right now. And there's a chapter, of course, we're talking about Du Bois right now, but this is
Oh,
one chapter in a larger book project on African American fashion in the 18th and 19th centuries. So my work often focuses on African American figures and their fashion, and particularly African American figures from the 18th and 19th centuries. So, for example, I wrote an article on Harriet Tubman for Miss Magazine, and I looked at photographs of Harriet Tubman and how her fashion in those photographs. Of course, there's only, less than 10 surviving photographs of Harriet Tubman, but that's actually quite a lot for a figure from the 19th century.
sure.
Um, and in particular, there was recently that we're finding more and more photos of Harriet Tubman. So there was a photo that was auctioned by Swan Galleries a few years ago of a younger Harriet Tubman who looked was very conscious. There was another photograph of Harriet Tubman that was found recently. So as time goes on, we're finding more images of her. So there's actually a lot to work with in that respect. Also recently wrote an essay on Phyllis Wheatley and her fashion. And when I first started the essay, I was really nervous about writing the essay because, there's only one iconic image of Phyllis Wheatley, the frontispiece from
Sure.
various subjects. So, but as of course, as I delved into the topic, there was actually a lot to say about that one frontispiece and a lot of correspondence from her enslaver about how she should be dressed in the frontispiece. And also in the essay, I looked at subsequent representations of Phyllis Wheatley and how African Americans sort of um, altered or reaffirmed Phyllis Wheatley's legacy through visual representations of her. So yeah, that to go back to your initial question, it's something that I do just in my larger scholarly practice. So Du Bois is just one example of a Black figure that I've sort of unpacked their fashion.
Do you, not to continue on this subject too long, but just another question about that was, do you know of anybody else who does this or takes this approach with historical figures?
There are other scholars, yeah. There aren't many.
Yeah,
Um, I would say Monica Miller is an important scholar of Black fashion who wrote a book called Slaves to Fashion, which is about enslaved people's dress in African American fashion. Tanisha Ford is another important Black fashion scholar. So there are other scholars doing this work.
yeah. It just seems to offer a completely different avenue to explore a figure that's probably any figure historically that has been examined to death in other ways, right? It gives you like a whole different way to go about examining their legacy or their history, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, and it's a really sort of rich area that people often neglect.
Du Bois led such a complex and long life, and there were like so many interesting chapters. You almost forget. I mean, how long, all of the different things. How did he accomplish? How did you end up focusing on the early years for, for your presentation?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think, I mean, most scholars tend to focus on the latter years of his life when he was the most prolific in terms of his writing.
Yeah,
Also starting, when he's the editor of The Crisis and like was, publishing multiple books. But I found the initial decades of his life to be the most interesting, particularly in terms of fashion, because the Bois is still in formation. And you can literally see it in how he's presenting himself in the world and what he's publishing. He's
yeah,
still sort of in the process of crafting himself into a public intellectual. He's also, I think, his most creative. And that creativity is born out of just lack of resources and money. He had to try many different things. So it's kind of his most creative moment in his life. And so you see him, um, you know, exploring different ideas, exploring different ways to present himself to the world. And I just find that moment really interesting. And also, I just think he has a really interesting childhood and
yeah,
upbringing. And I people don't really focus again because they focus rightly so on his politics and on his intellectual thought. But I think you get a lot of information when you look at someone's biography and see it, where they were raised, who raised them, who were their neighbors, how are they educated, who was
yeah.
part of their community, how are they dressing themselves.
How much do you think the impact, I believe his father died when he was young. His mother had a stroke. How much do you think that sort of impacted him growing up, or maybe impacted his approach to the way he viewed his role in the society, or how he approached life?
Yeah, his childhood wasn't easy. Like you said, he was estranged from his father, who died quite early. And he grew up in poverty with his brother, which he doesn't really talk very much about.
Right.
And I assume that that relationship was strained too. And his mother also died quite young, as you said, from a stroke. And so I think, it certainly shaped the way he, navigated the world. And I think he wanted to sort of create stability that he didn't have in his childhood.
How do you track the boys' style evolution in your work, and why is it important?
Yeah, I mean, the primary source for this chapter is photographs. Yeah, again, which is a departure from other scholars of Du Bois who focus on his writing. But Du Bois was photographed throughout his entire life, starting from when he was a baby sitting on his mother's lap to, a few months before he died. So you can see the sort of arc of his life through photographs. And so I do close visual analyses of these photographs to see how, one, he was styled
Yeah.
initially by his mother um, and by his family, but also how he styles himself over the course of his life.
Do you?
I also
God, I'm sorry.
also sorry, I also I do of course do textual analysis of his writing too.
Yeah. How does today's technology, play into your ability to examine photos in a way that maybe 20 years ago um was uh was not possible?
It's great. Um, a lot of his papers have been digitized and are free and available online. So anyone who's listening to this conversation and would like to delve into his papers, you can go to UMass Amherst library. Many of his papers have been digitized, and you can. I have been in person to the Du Bois archives, but you
Yeah.
don't have to go in person. Many of them are available online. Not only are they available online, but they've been scanned and made word searchable. So if you're interested in a particular topic, you can search for, say, Du Bois and Pan-Africanism.
Yeah.
Uh, and that wouldn't have been possible, as you mentioned, 20 years ago. So I've really benefited from digital archiving.
Well, that's interesting. The whole evolution of the internet, and what you can find on topics that maybe you would have been interested in 25 or 30 years ago, but would have not been able to find easily. Now you can sit at your desk, print out a bunch of stuff, and then go, read it at lunch, which you can tell I typically do. But also, I also think with regard to looking at photos, I always think of people examining historical events. You see articles from the 60s, and somebody's got a big microscope, a magnifying glass, and they've got it against a photo and they're kind of tracking it along the photo to look at it. Now you can take those same photos 25 years later with all of the technology that has evolved. You must be able to really kind of sink your teeth into looking at a particular photo from a lot of different, with a lot of different tools. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and also like I mentioned earlier in the conversation in reference to Harriet Tubman, like people are finding new photographs of her, and that's thanks in part to digital technology. All this printed material is being digitized and made available online, so more eyes can be on it, and also it can be scanned through OCR, which is
Yeah.
the word for the technology used for um, scanning text online. Um, yeah, so you're absolutely right. There's all these tools that are available now, and it's helping us sort of excavate and comb through all this archival material, which in the past you would have had to um, travel to an archive in Great Barrington
Sure.
or somewhere else and get the microfilm and stick it on a machine and scroll through but again, all that stuff is being made available. I do have to say though, I always tell my students um, the fact that there's so much available online, it gives the illusion that everything is online,
Right.
and that's not true. Only a fraction of printed material has been made available online. That's changing every day. More and more stuff is being made available online, but you still have to go to the archive, and you still have to talk to archivists, and you still have to talk to librarians because there are things that haven't been cataloged yet.
I think the other thing, and it just kind of occurred to me as you were talking though, I think the other thing about the internet and social media, and one of the rare positives is that a lot more conversation is likely to be happening between people of like interests who can discuss, say, Du Bois, history or fashion, but also it gets the word out. Somebody may have an old box of photos that they may not even be aware of the value of it, or to a scholar, and now all of a sudden, it's easier to get the word out, I would think. So there's probably more things being discovered now than there would have been 50 years ago or even 30 years ago because of, again, internet and contact. And I think the other thing, and this is something I always think about, is, and I'm not sure if it's true, you spend a lot more time doing this, but I would think your ability to find photos or to more easily, because of the internet, research and look into things, it gives you more time to sort of ponder and think, right? You have more time to actually analyze, think about what you found, right? Or converse with other people about it. It's a great opportunity. I didn't think about it until you were just talking about this, but I would think that there's much more time for dialogue and thought than there was 20 years ago when you'd spend 15 hours in the library to look for one document that now you can find online, and now you have that 15 hours to kind of sort of put it into perspective, right? I mean, is that accurate to say what you think?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. I have two examples of what you're just described. I recently found a photograph of Du Bois in Ghana with his granddaughter.
That's amazing.
Um, and the only reason I was able to find it is because an article had been published by one of his great grandsons who had this photograph because it's a family photo. And the journalist was able to take a scan of it and publish it alongside the article. So I think in the past, that photograph wouldn't have been made available to the public. You would have had to go to his granddaughter's papers that are archived, who knows where, or his great grandson's family home to see the photograph.
Sure.
So that's one example. But another more a broader example is, I have a digital humanities project called Fashioning the Self in Slavery and Freedom. And that project lives primarily via social media, like it's digitally native. And I often share like my research insights and findings on this platform on, Twitter or X or Facebook or Instagram. And my research is really enriched by doing it. I think a lot of scholars are nervous about sharing their work
Sure.
with others before it's published out of fear that they might get plagiarized or someone's going to steal their idea. But I find that I get a lot of it. I get a lot out of it because when I share something, I get 10 times the response back from it. And I
Sure.
can figure out what lands with people, what doesn't land with people, how I need to restructure an argument to make it more effective. People tell me about archives that I need to visit to sort of push my argument further. So I think my research is really enriched by sharing it online. So yeah, I totally agree with what you just said.
Yeah, I think it's really, I hadn't really much, and again, I hadn't really given it as much thought as I, until you just were talking about, relying on photos. Um, when you do rely on photos and you make your observations, um, it seems like you, and you've said this before, Du Bois was very aware of the camera and how important it was to, although it wasn't referred to at this time, his brand. What makes you kind of draw that conclusion?
Yeah, I mean, here I'm really drawing on the scholarship on Frederick Douglass. So a number of scholars have noted that Frederick Douglass was the most photographed man in the 19th century. He was actually photographed more than any other American president in the
It's
19th
amazing.
century. right? Isn't it?
Yeah,
And he, that was on purpose. It wasn't accidental. He believed that portrait painters, um, white portrait painters were biased. And so if someone were to paint his portrait, they wouldn't capture his likeness accurately, like it would be influenced by racism.
sure.
And so he thought the camera was more scientific and less biased. And he actually wrote two essays about the power of photography and African Americans' relationship with the camera. And I think Du Bois had a similar relationship with the camera. And unlike Frederick Douglass, who was born enslaved, Du Bois was born free. I mean, like I said, he wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth. They were quite poor. But, he grew up in this corner of the Berkshires. His family had been in that part of New England for several generations before the Revolutionary War. And they were to some degree respected.
Sure.
So they weren't rich, they weren't moneyed by any means, but they also had access to resources. So the boys, went to an integrated school and had a high school diploma and went to college. And that wasn't true for most African Americans in the late 19th century. And so because they had a modicum of resources, he was able to be photographed throughout his entire life. And he understood what a camera was and the power of photography. And his family introduced him to this technology earlier in his life. So
And
when
he
you
was,
look at,
God, I'm sorry.
Mhm.
No, and
Oh,
he was
sorry.
quickly able to grasp the value of it, wasn't he?
Exactly, exactly. And that's not true for all African Americans. So, when I look at photographs of Black folks from the late 19th century, sometimes, you can sense like confusion or anger or a photograph being taken under duress. Whereas you can see in the photographs of the boys that these were um, voluntary, in that I'm thinking in particular of a photograph from 1872 when he was 4 years old. And I mean, I think we've all experienced or can imagine, a photograph of a 4-year-old, how difficult that can be. But in this photograph, he looks so posed and
Yeah.
like he's wearing, and I'll actually show it in the presentation that I'm giving. But he's wearing like, booties and stockings. Like it's a very Victorian photo, and he understood what was happening. And so all that to say is that he grew up relatively privileged vis-a-vis most African Americans in the late 19th century. And for that reason, he understood and had an early introduction to photographic technology.
How important do you think it was for him to present a dapper image of himself, especially, in the early years of his professional life when he was establishing himself?
Oh, it was crucial. It was crucial. Yeah, I mean, in particular, I'm thinking of a photograph of the boys in Paris in 1900. So as I mentioned, his scholarly practice was multifaceted. Like he's known for his, intellectual and political thought, but he also did creative writing, and he also curated exhibitions. So he went to Paris in 1900 to curate an exhibition at a World's Fair um, called The American Negro. And he was invited by a college friend to co-curate this exhibition. And it was photographs of African Americans, prosperous African Americans. And the idea, this is the heyday of scientific racism, where people believed in a hierarchy of races. And of course, people of color were on the bottom of that hierarchy. So the point of this exhibition was to show the progress that African Americans had made since abolition in 1865. And while he was there, he was photographed. And we don't know who the photographer was, but it's probably at the hotel or the inn that he was staying at. And he's standing in the doorway. I also show this photograph in my presentation, but he's wearing a top hat. Um, and what's interesting about this photograph is that, he's very dapper in his photograph, as he always is in his
Yeah.
photographs. But after the photograph was taken, at some point, someone, probably Du Bois himself, sort of carefully took a pen and out sort of added creases to the pants and added a sheen to the top hat. So he was very um, interested and concerned about his self-presentation to the point of post-production altering photographs. So yeah,
That's
like I was saying.
that's amazing. Post-production. That's great. Do you think, do you think that he viewed the way he presented himself as sort of setting examples for fellow African Americans?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the boys, um, and this is one of the things that the boys is known for, but this concept of the talented 10th, published this essay called The Talented 10th in 1903. And he argued that um, a tenth of African Americans were part of race leadership um, due to their intellect, their leadership skills, education, etc. And that this talented 10th had a responsibility to uplift the entire African American community through their education, activism, political act, etc. So yeah, absolutely. And I think fashion played a part of this idea of the talented 10th because they dressed respectably and served as an example for the larger African American community.
I think the other thing too, I always wonder is, how important do you think it was for someone in his position who was a vocal leader pushing for civil rights, not just sort of adopting the Booker T. Washington approach, but really being out there pushing, at a volatile time. How important do you think it was for someone in that role to present themselves the way he did, which is well dressed, clearly well educated, somebody that, this was not somebody that, you could dismiss, or at least, or did you think that mattered?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think just to repeat what you said, his survival and success as an activist and civil rights leader hinged on how he presented himself to the world. And that's not just true with the boys. I think that you could find other like very good examples of that. I mean, think about Frederick Douglass, as we already mentioned, and going past the boys, um, King in some way picked up the torch that the boys was carrying. And he was also someone who dressed very dapperly, dressed very smartly. Same with Malcolm X.
Sure.
Um,
With the bow
he's known for
ties.
his exactly, yeah. And you can even bring it all the way up to the 21st century with someone like Barack Obama. He
Right.
also is known for as a snappy dresser. And on the flip side, there's people who sort of fly in the face of respectability. Um, so think about the way Snick dress and they're wearing denim overalls in solidarity with agricultural laborers and sharecroppers, or think about the Black Power movement and sort of the rebellious um, all black outfits that they would wear and the berets that sort of harken back to revolutionaries and the leather jackets that sort of speaks to like outsiderism. Um, or even think about how people dressed during the BLM movement, or Rick McKesson, how he wears his Patagonia puffer as also like a signal of like the importance of sustainability.
Yeah.
So there's two camps. There's of course the sort of respectable sort of line of self-fashioning, but also there's people who sort of um, do the opposite and do a counter respectability self-fashioning.
Well, what's interesting is like there was conflict between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, but they also were they both presented in a particular way that you really, as someone who, that was one area you really couldn't attack them, right? You couldn't attack them and say, look at how he's dressed, or look at, that's one area where they both seemed, and I guess you could say the same thing about Malcolm and Martin Luther King. I mean, they didn't always agree on the approach, but they both, you couldn't, they both understood. Now I totally understanding where you're coming from with this idea. It's really interesting when you start reeling off how people dress in, one phase of life versus another. It's a really interesting way to kind of examine, look at historical figures. I mean, you could probably go on with this all day, right? With all the different people that you look at, or you probably do.
I do. I do, absolutely.
Well, this the boys lived just like this incredible life. What 1868 to 1963, so much history is encompassed in that span. I mean, do you have any thoughts on how his fashion sort of continued to develop in his later years?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so as I mentioned, I'm working on a book manuscript, and one of the chapters from the book is on the boys. In the actual chapter, I really do focus on the first few decades of his life up until roughly the turn of the century.
Yeah,
But his self-fashioning continued to evolve, of course, throughout his entire life, as it does with all of us. I dressed very different when I was a kid as opposed to the way I dress now, and I probably dress very differently later in life. And it's true for the boys too. His life sort of spanned, he was born in 1868, so that's like the Reconstruction era, and he lived through civil rights and the Roaring
space.
Twenties and the Harlem Renaissance and two world wars, and so yeah, you can track sort of American history onto the boys and how he was fashioning himself. So towards the end of his life, like many intellectuals, he experimented and studied um, Marxism and Trotskyism, and also spent some time in the Soviet Union. And for that reason, he was put on a list and eventually blacklisted, and the US government confiscated his passport. And another idea that he had experimented with was Pan-Africanism. So the idea that all people of African descent, regardless if they're in the US or the Caribbean or Latin America or on the African continent, had some kinship. And so though he became very friendly with the first president of Ghana, whose name was Kwame Nkrumah, who was also a Pan-Africanist. So when his passport was confiscated, Kwame Nkrumah invited the boys to live in Ghana. And so he spent the last years of his life in Ghana. And in Ghana, you see him evolving in terms of fashion. We often associate the practice of African Americans adopting African textiles into their wardrobes with the 1960s and 1970s, but it was also happening a little bit earlier. And so I've seen photos of the boys in the late 50s, early 60s, incorporating kente cloth into his fashion. Of course, he did it in a very Du Bois way. So when he wore a kente cloth wrapper, he wore it over a suit. Traditionally, the way you wear a kente cloth wrapper is that you're shirtless, you sort of wear it over, sort of wrap it around your body. But he would wear, a button-up shirt, trousers, and a tie, and then put a kente cloth wrapper over it. So
So he was unique. He was unique to the end, even as he was sort of experimenting.
exactly. Enigmatic.
He would have been a fascinating figure. I imagine that in all the time that you've spent studying him, he's probably somebody you would love to have sat down with and had a discussion.
Oh, the stories.
Yes.
Yeah, totally someone I would love to um have dinner with and pick his brain.
I
All the
mean,
things that he saw.
dinner, it probably would have been breakfast, lunch, dinner, and you still wouldn't have been satisfied. I mean, you think about like his experiences in Philadelphia, then in Atlanta, obviously even before growing up, and then obviously the NAACP and everything else it's almost bewildering to think of somebody packing that much into one life. Even if you live a long life, it's incredible how much he packed into it.
One thing that I'm really interested in is um African Americans' relationship with the company Brooks Brothers. So
Right.
another chapter in this book is on Brooks Brothers, which is of course is American um clothing company founded in 1818. And because the company is so old and because its product lines were so multifaceted, um, some of their clothes ended up on the backs of enslaved people in the 19th century. And so the chapter before the Du Bois chapter looks at this relationship between Brooks Brothers and histories of enslavement. But one interesting contradiction is that Du Bois was a Brooks Brothers customer, and many African Americans are
Right.
customers of Brooks Brothers. And so Also, just going back to like thinking about Du Bois's life is also full of interesting contradictions as well.
Yeah, and that's almost like it seems like, and you had mentioned when we talked before the connection with Brooks Brothers, but it almost seems like that's one of those like heritage passed down from generation to generation, and maybe not necessarily being aware of, or maybe being aware and not necessarily worrying about that. But it seems like that was more of the case of, it was almost a tradition to wear Brooks Brothers if you had, an interest in dressing in a certain way.
Absolutely.
When you look at all the different things that he accomplished, um, I guess, and I don't even know if this is fair to say. Do you think Du Bois is better known than maybe, or should be better known, or do you think he is well known enough among people that actually study history? Where do you think he stands, and do you think he should have a higher profile?
Du Bois is a really interesting figure because I would say he's fairly well known. So, during Black History Month, um, I think people would probably name him as an important African American figure alongside Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and, you know, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. But I think that people engage with Du Bois in very particular ways, and they don't really delve into the complexity of him as a human being. They focus on a handful of books
Yeah.
and a handful of images, typically from the later half of his life when he sort of had crafted himself into W.E.B. Du Bois. And they don't look at something like fashion. And so I think focusing on his self-fashioning sort of can humanize Du Bois in a way, and also look at his intellectual thought in a different way. And that's something I also did in the Harriet Tubman article. We have a very sort of stoic vision of who Harriet Tubman was, and
Yes.
sort of thinking about her self-fashioning and how she engaged with garments and her relationship with the camera also gives you a new sort of way of thinking about Harriet Tubman that's a little more human and more multifaceted.
So, last question, I guess, would be what do you hope people who attend this lecture take away from it?
I would say that I want people to understand the importance of fashion when you consider how African Americans have carved out a space for themselves in our country. And I personally use Du Bois as a case study, but you can easily replace Du Bois with another prominent African American figure, or you can even replace Du Bois with someone who's not even prominent, just an everyday individual. So I would say that, as you said, fashion is an important window into looking at um, the human experience.
Well, I could go on for another hour, but unfortunately, we don't have that time. I really appreciate you making time for us today, and we're really looking forward to your lecture on April 11th at Rosecliff. Um, there will be information on the website as we get closer to finalizing all the details for the program itself, which features 3 lectures. But the lecture is titled "The Measure of a Man: Double Consciousness and the Fashioning of W.E. Du Bois." And we thank you very much, Professor Square, for being here with us.
No, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.